He looked me right in the eyes across that restaurant table. My father, the man I had spent 37 years trying to understand. And he said something I will never forget. He said it calmly, the way he always said things that were meant to destroy you. He set his fork down, dabbed the corner of his mouth with a linen napkin, and he said, "You were never supposed to find out. And honestly, I wish you hadn't. It would have been easier for everyone." Easier for everyone. Not easier for me. Easier for everyone else. The restaurant was called the Birch Room, a small, upscale place on the north side of Edinburgh, the kind with cloth napkins and candles that smell faintly of cedar. I remember the candle between us because I stared at it for a long time after he said that. I stared at the flame bending slightly in the draft from the door, and I thought about how strange it is that fire looks so alive, and yet it has no heart, no memory, no loyalty. Just heat and light and consumption. He was waiting for me to cry. I could see it in his posture, the way he leaned back slightly, the way his hand stayed near his water glass like he was bracing for a scene. He had spent my entire life expecting me to be fragile. And for most of it, I had been. Or at least I had let him believe I was. But that night, I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I looked at the flame, and then I looked at him, and I said, "I know exactly what you did. All of it. Not just the test." And for the first time in my life, I watched my father's face change into something I had never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment. Fear. My name is Ailie McCallum. I am 37 years old, and I live in Edinburgh, Scotland. This is the story of how my father paid £3,000 to bury the results of a DNA test, how my doctor revealed everything he had hidden, and how the truth did not destroy me the way he expected it to. It rebuilt me from the ground up. But it took years, and it cost me people I loved, people I thought loved me, and a version of myself I had carried around like a second skin since I was a child. I need to go back. Not just to the test. Not just to the doctor's appointment that cracked everything open. I need to go further. Because you cannot understand what happened in that restaurant unless you understand who I was before it, and who I had been trained to be. I grew up in Corstorphine, a quiet residential part of Edinburgh where the houses all look respectable, and the gardens are trimmed, and nobody talks about anything that matters. My father, Douglas McCallum, was a solicitor with a firm on George Street. Not a famous one, not a partner, but comfortable enough to wear good suits and drive a dark green Jaguar, and believe that these things made him important. My mother, Fiona, was a dental hygienist who stopped working when I was born and never went back. She made scones on Saturdays and kept the house spotless and did not ask questions. I was their only child, or at least I was the only child in the house. I was a quiet girl, not shy exactly, but watchful. I had a habit of standing in doorways instead of walking through them, of listening to conversations from the hallway, of reading people's faces before I decided whether it was safe to speak. My father once told a neighbor I was mousy. He said it with a laugh, like it was charming. I was 9. I remember standing behind the hedge with a glass of lemonade, and I remember the lemonade going warm in my hand while I stood there deciding whether mousy was something I could fix or something I was. My grandmother on my mother's side, Nan Beattie, was the one who saw me clearly. She lived alone in a council flat in Leith, a place that smelled like shortbread and old radiators. She had been a nurse at the Royal Infirmary for 31 years, and she had hands like warm bread, soft and strong at the same time. Every Sunday she would take me to Inverleith Park, and we would walk along the pond and she would tell me things, not fairy tales, real things. One afternoon, I must have been 11, I told her that I felt like I did not belong in my own family. I said it in the way children do, not dramatically, just matter-of-factly, the way you might say the sky looks gray today. She stopped walking and looked down at me, and she said something I have carried in my chest like a stone ever since. She said, "Belonging is not something anyone gives you, Ailey. It is something you build with your own two hands." And sometimes the people closest to you will try to knock it down, and you will have to build it again, and again, and again. I did not understand her then. I thought she was talking about friendships or school, but she was not. She was talking about what was coming. I studied biomedical science at the University of Edinburgh. I was not brilliant in the way that gets you prizes, but I was relentless. I read everything twice. I stayed late in the lab when others went to the pub. I got a first-class degree, and then I kept going, completing a postgraduate certificate in clinical genetics. I became a genetic counselor, working at the Western General Hospital. My job was to sit with people and explain what their DNA meant, what their test results said about their risks, their children's risks, their futures. I was good at it. I was good at translating terror into something a person could hold. The irony of that, a woman whose entire professional life revolved around genetic truth, not knowing the most basic genetic truth about herself, is not lost on me. It was never lost on me, even before I knew what I did not know. Because there were signs. There were always signs. I looked nothing like my father. Nothing. He was tall, broad, fair-haired, blue-eyed, built like a man who had rowed at university, which he had. I was small, dark-haired, olive-skinned in a way that made people in Edinburgh ask me where I was originally from. My eyes were brown, almost black in certain light. My mother was fair too, freckled, with reddish hair. When I stood between them in photographs, I looked like a child who had wandered in from another family's portrait. People noticed. Of course they noticed. At school, a boy named Callum Hendry told me I was adopted, and when I went home crying, my father said, "You look like your great-aunt Margaret." End of discussion. I never met great-aunt Margaret. I never saw a photograph of her. And I learned very early that some doors in our house were not meant to be opened. My name is Fiona Alistair Drummond. I was born in 1987 in Edinburgh's Royal Infirmary, raised in a sandstone terrace house on Cumleybank Avenue in Stockbridge, the kind of street where the bins go out on Tuesday and nobody ever raises their voice above the hedge line. My father, Robert Drummond, was a consultant urologist at the Western General. My mother, Catherine, had been a nurse before she married him, then became what she called a full-time mother, which meant she ironed his shirts, organized the dinner parties, and slowly, year by year, disappeared into the architecture of his life. I was their only child, or rather, I was his only child. That distinction would come to matter more than anything. Growing up, I was quiet, not shy, which is what people assumed, but watchful. I listened more than I spoke because I had learned that in our house, speaking was a privilege my father controlled. He decided the topics at dinner. He decided when a conversation was over. He decided what was funny, what was serious, what was worth discussing, and what was beneath discussion. My mother would sometimes start a sentence and then look at him, mid-word, to see if she was allowed to finish it. Most of the time she was. Sometimes she wasn't, and the sentence would just trail off into the clink of cutlery on porcelain. I did well at school. Not spectacularly, not in the way he wanted, which was prizes and podiums and letters from headmasters. I did well quietly, consistently, in that way that teachers describe as diligent when they mean not brilliant but impossible to fault. I loved biology. I loved the logic of it, the way cells behaved according to rules, the way a body could be understood if you looked closely enough. By the time I was 16, I knew I wanted to study medicine. My father said nothing about this for 3 full days, and then at dinner he said, "Medicine's a long road, Fiona. You'll need to be certain you can handle it." Not encouragement, not discouragement, just a reminder that the road belonged to him first, and I was asking permission to walk on it. I got into Edinburgh Medical School. He said, "Well, it's not as competitive as it was in my year, but it's respectable." My mother hugged me in the kitchen later and whispered, "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart." And her eyes were wet. And I remember thinking it was strange that pride had to be whispered in our house, like it was something illicit. Medical school was where I met Grandpa Alec. He wasn't my grandfather by blood, not that I knew what blood meant in my family at the time. He was Dr. Alec Beatty, a retired pathologist who volunteered in the anatomy department, 73 years old, with hands that shook slightly and eyes that missed nothing. He had no children of his own. His wife had died in 2001. He came to the medical school 3 mornings a week because, he said, the alternative was talking to his cat about the cricket, and the cat was a poor conversationalist. He took an interest in me the way some older people do when they recognize something familiar in a younger person's silence. He never asked me why I was quiet. He never told me to speak up or be more confident. He just started leaving me articles on his desk, papers on genetic pathology, case studies from the British Medical Journal, always with a yellow sticky note that said something like, "Thought of you," or "This one's interesting." Once, after I presented a case study to the tutorial group and my voice shook the entire time, he found me in the corridor afterward and said, "You know, Fiona, the ones who shake are the ones who care. The steady ones are just performing." That sentence lived in me. It still does. He became the person I talked to when I couldn't talk to anyone else. Not about feelings, not in any dramatic way. We talked about medicine, about cases, about the ethics of diagnosis, about what it means to tell a patient something that will change their life. But underneath those conversations, something else was happening. He was teaching me that knowledge is not the same as power. Knowledge, he said, is responsibility. Anyone can find something out, he told me once, over weak tea in his cramped office on Teviot Place. The question is what you do with it, whether you use it to help or to control. That's the only question that matters, really. I didn't understand why he kept saying this. I thought it was general wisdom, the kind old men offer because they've seen enough to distill life into sentences. I didn't realize he was preparing me. He couldn't have known specifically what was coming, but I think he saw something in my family from the few things I let slip. Small details about my father's silences, my mother's deference, the strange absence of family photographs from before my birth. He never pushed. He just kept saying that one phrase, in different ways at different times. Knowledge is responsibility. My father came to my white coat ceremony. He sat in the 3rd row and checked his phone twice during the dean's address. Afterward, he shook my hand. Not a hug, a handshake, firm and brief, as though we had concluded a business transaction. My mother took a photograph. In it, his smile doesn't reach his eyes, and I am looking not at the camera but slightly to the left, at Grandpa Alec, who was standing off to the side, clapping with his shaking hands, beaming like I was his own. That photograph sits in a frame on my bookshelf now. I look at it sometimes and try to remember what I was feeling in that moment, whether I was proud or just relieved. I think it was relief. Relief that I had made it to a point where my competence was undeniable, where even my father would have to acknowledge that I had done something real. But a handshake. He gave me a handshake at my white coat ceremony. I remember watching other families afterward, fathers lifting their daughters off the ground, mothers crying into tissues, siblings holding balloons. My father was already walking toward the parking lot, phone pressed to his ear, talking to someone about a property closing in Buckhead. The pattern did not begin there. It began much earlier, but it took me years to see it as a pattern rather than a series of isolated disappointments. When you grow up inside something, you do not recognize its shape. You just breathe the air and assume it is normal. The first time I understood that something was fundamentally wrong, I was 11. My father hosted a barbecue at our house for the 4th of July. The backyard was full of his colleagues from the firm, their wives, their children. My mother had been cooking since 5 in the morning, brisket and coleslaw, and her cornbread that people still talk about. She set everything out on the long folding tables, arranged the napkins, put citronella candles along the fence to keep the mosquitoes away. I helped her carry the coolers. My half-brother Kevin, who was 14 at the time and visited every other weekend from his mother's house in Marietta, sat on the porch playing his Game Boy the entire time. When my father stood up to say a few words, beer in hand, sun on his face, he thanked everyone for coming. He talked about the firm, about community, about family. Then he put his hand on Kevin's shoulder and said, "This is my son, Kevin, who just made the all-star baseball team." Everyone clapped. Kevin barely looked up. My father did not mention me. He did not mention my mother. She was standing 3 feet away, holding a tray of lemon bars, and her face did not change. She just turned and walked back into the kitchen. I followed her. She was standing at the sink, water running, not washing anything, just letting the water run over her hands. I asked her if she was okay. She said, "Go back outside, Naomi. Enjoy the party." Her voice was perfectly even, the way a voice sounds when someone has practiced keeping it even for a very long time. I went back outside. I ate a hot dog. I did not enjoy the party. The second time was when I was 15. I had won the regional science fair with a project on antibiotic resistance in soil bacteria. It was a serious project. My biology teacher, Mrs. Whitfield, had helped me design the methodology, and I had spent 4 months culturing samples in the school lab after hours. The award came with a $500 scholarship and an invitation to the state competition in Macon. I brought the certificate home and put it on the kitchen table. My father was reading the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He glanced at it, said, "That is nice," and turned the page. That same week, Kevin got a C+ on a history test, and my father took him to celebrate at the varsity because, and I am quoting directly, "The boy is improving, and that deserves recognition." My mother said nothing. I said nothing. Mrs. Whitfield drove me to Macon herself because my parents could not make it. I placed 3rd in the state. I called home from a payphone at the convention center. My mother answered and said she was proud of me. My father was not home. The third time was the summer before college. I had been accepted to Emory with a partial scholarship. It was the best day of my life up to that point. I had worked for it with everything I had, every AP class, every extracurricular, every early morning and late night. My father sat me down at the dining room table and told me he would not be contributing to my tuition. He said he had financial obligations, that Kevin's mother was taking him back to court for increased child support, that the firm was going through a rough quarter. He said I was smart and I would figure it out. I asked him if he was helping Kevin with college. He paused for just a moment too long and said that is a different situation. I did not ask what made it different. I already knew, or I thought I knew. I took out loans. I worked 2 jobs my freshman year, one at the campus library and one at a coffee shop on North Decatur Road, where the espresso machine leaked steam and left a scar on my left forearm that I still have. A thin white line right below the wrist. People sometimes glance at it and then look away quickly, assuming something else. It is just a burn from a bad gasket. But I kept it the way soldiers keep scars, as proof that I was there, and it cost me something. The fourth time was the worst, because it was the most public. I was 23, in my second year of medical school, and my father held a retirement party for himself at a restaurant in Midtown, a place called Dolce on Peachtree with white tablecloths and low lighting. He had invited 40 people, family, colleagues, old friends. He gave a speech. He talked about his career, his legacy, what he had built. He talked about his children, child, singular. He talked about Kevin, who had just started a job at a logistics company in Kennesaw. He said he was proud of the man Kevin was becoming. He said Kevin had his drive, his determination. The room clapped politely. I was sitting at the table closest to the podium, in a dress my mother had ironed that morning, with my hands folded in my lap. He did not say my name. Not once in 12 minutes. My mother reached under the table and squeezed my hand. Her grip was tight, almost painful, and when I looked at her, her jaw was set and her eyes were wet, but she did not cry. Neither did I. We had both learned that skill by then. After the speech, one of his colleagues, a woman named Diane who had always been kind to me, came over and asked if I was Robert's daughter. I said yes. She said she did not know he had a daughter. She said he talked about his son all the time at work, but had never mentioned me. She said this with genuine surprise, not cruelty, which made it worse. I excused myself and went to the restroom. I stood in front of the mirror for 2 full minutes. I did not cry. I washed my hands, dried them on the cloth towel, straightened my dress, and went back to the table. I finished my dinner. I laughed at someone's joke about golf. I drove home alone afterward on I-85 with the windows down, and it was only then, at 70 miles an hour with the night air filling the car, that I let myself make any sound at all. It was not crying exactly. It was something lower, something from the chest, a sound I had never made before and have never made since. By the time I reached my apartment in Decatur, it was over. I parked. I went inside. I studied for 3 hours. I scored a 94 on my pathology exam that Friday. I could have confronted him. After the retirement dinner, I could have stood up and said something. I could have made a scene, demanded to know why his own daughter was invisible to him, while his son from another woman occupied every inch of his pride. But I did not. And it was not weakness. It was something Grandpa Alec had taught me without meaning to, that you do not show your cards to someone who has already decided what hand you are holding. My father had decided what I was. He had decided it long before I could speak or walk or read or win science fairs or get into medical school. I just did not know yet what that decision was or why he had made it. That understanding came later. It came from a place I never expected, and it changed the shape of everything I thought I knew about my own life. It came on a Tuesday in November, 3 weeks after Grandpa Alec's funeral. I was sitting in the break room at Royal Berkshire Hospital, still wearing my white coat, eating a sandwich I did not taste. Grandpa Alec had died quietly in his sleep on the 27th of October. No drama, no prolonged illness. Just a man who had lived 89 years deciding, apparently, that he had seen enough. At the funeral, in the small church outside Henley-on-Thames, my father had cried. Actual tears. I watched them roll down his face, and I remember thinking that was the first time I had ever seen him cry. He had not cried at his own mother's funeral 4 years earlier. He had not cried when I graduated from medical school. He cried for Grandpa Alec, and even in my grief, I noticed that he cried the way a man cries when he has lost the last person who knew the truth about him. I did not understand that observation yet. It just lodged itself somewhere behind my ribs, like a splinter too deep to reach. 3 weeks later, Dr. Fiona Hadley sat down across from me in the break room with 2 cups of tea and a face I had learned to read over 6 years of working under her in pediatric medicine. She had a particular expression for difficult conversations. Mouth set, eyes soft, hands wrapped around the cup as though she needed warmth before she could begin. She was 53, silver-haired, built like a distance runner, and she had been more of a parent to me during my residency than either of my actual parents had been in 30 years. She said my name, just my name, Nora. I put the sandwich down. She told me she had been reviewing genetic screening files from a research study we had participated in 2 years prior, a voluntary familial genetics panel that several staff members had joined, myself included. The hospital had partnered with a genomics lab in Cambridge for a hereditary disease mapping project. I had submitted my sample without a second thought. It was routine. It was science. I had forgotten about it entirely. Fiona had not forgotten. She had been contacted by the lab because of an anomaly in my results that they wanted to flag before the study data was anonymized and published. They had cross-referenced my panel with publicly available genetic databases, as was standard for verification, and they had found a match that did not align with my declared family history. She paused. She looked at me with those soft eyes. I said, "What kind of match?" She said, "Your paternal markers do not correspond to the surname lineage you listed on your intake form." The lab found a much closer paternal match to a different family entirely. They assumed it was a clerical error and wanted to confirm before finalizing the dataset. I sat there with the fluorescent light buzzing above me and the smell of someone's microwaved curry drifting from the counter and the sound of a porter wheeling something down the corridor outside. And I heard every single one of those sounds with absolute clarity, because my mind had gone completely, perfectly still. I asked Fiona what she meant by a different family entirely. She slid a printed summary across the table. She said she was not supposed to show me this, that technically it should have gone through the ethics board first, but she had known me for 6 years and she believed I deserved to see it now rather than in 3 months through a formal letter. The summary showed my mitochondrial DNA, my paternal haplogroup, and a highlighted line indicating a near-certain paternal link to a genetic profile already in the database belonging to a man named Dr. James Whitfield, a retired cardiologist from Surrey who had contributed his own sample to the same Cambridge study. I had never heard that name before. I read it 3 times. I read the confidence interval. 98.6% probability of first-degree paternal relationship. Fiona watched me. She did not rush. She did not fill the silence with comfort or speculation. She just sat with me in that terrible, luminous moment and let me arrive at the conclusion on my own. My father was not my father. Or rather, Gerald Ashworth, the man who had raised me in his house, who had paid for my school uniforms, who had walked past my bedroom door 10,000 times without stopping, was not my biological father. He had always known. That was the splinter behind my ribs, the thing I had sensed at Grandpa Alec's funeral without being able to name it. Gerald had cried because Alec was the last person who had known and who had chosen to love me anyway. With Alec gone, the secret had no guardian. It was just a secret now, sitting in a dead man's silence, waiting. And then I understood everything. The distance, the preference for Thomas, the way Gerald's eyes skipped over me like I was a sentence in a language he refused to learn. I was not his. I had never been his. And rather than say so, rather than be honest, he had simply subtracted me from his attention, year after year, until the gap was so ordinary that no one questioned it. I did not cry. Not there, not in front of Fiona, not under the buzzing light. I folded the paper once, then again, and I placed it in the inside pocket of my white coat, against my chest, where it sat like a second heartbeat for the rest of my shift. That evening, I drove home to my flat in Caversham and sat in the car park for 40 minutes with the engine off and the windows fogging. That was where I cried. Alone, in the dark, with the rain tapping on the roof of my second-hand Vauxhall, I cried for the little girl who had tried so hard to be enough for a man who had already decided she was evidence of something he wanted to forget. Then I stopped. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my coat, and I felt something settle into place inside me. Not anger, not grief, but a cold, clean clarity, like a scalpel still wrapped in sterile packaging. Grandpa Alec's voice came to me then, the phrase he had said so many times it was practically etched into my bones. The truth does not care if you are ready for it, Nora. It only cares that you do not look away. I was not going to look away. I did not sleep that night. I drove back to the cottage, made a pot of tea I never drank, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen. The rain had stopped by then, and the silence felt like an accomplice, like the house itself was leaning in, waiting to see what I would do next. The first thing I wrote was a name: Dr. Felicity Ashworth. She had been my GP since I was 19, since I had registered at the practice near the University of Kent during my first year studying biomedical science. She had referred me for the autoimmune panel 3 years ago when I started getting the joint flares, and she was the one who had flagged the blood group discrepancy in my file, the one that had started the quiet unraveling of everything. I needed to speak with her again, not as a patient this time, but as someone who needed to understand exactly what records existed and who had access to them. I wrote her name, underlined it twice, and moved on. The second name was Margaret Hale, Mum's older sister, the one who lived alone in a narrow terrace house in Whitstable and who had always looked at Dad with an expression I could never quite read. Not dislike exactly, more like someone watching a pot they knew would eventually boil over. Aunt Margaret had tried to say something to me once, years ago, at a family barbecue in the garden. She had started a sentence with, "Your father is not," and then stopped, pressed her lips together, and changed the subject to whether I wanted more coleslaw. I had been 15. I had not pressed her. I would press her now. The third thing I wrote was not a name, but a number. £72,000. That was the amount Grandpa Alec had left me in trust, managed by a solicitor in Canterbury named Philip Drayton, separate from the family, separate from anything Dad could touch. Grandpa Alec had set it up that way on purpose. I understood that now. He had known, or at least suspected, that there would come a day when I needed resources that could not be intercepted or redirected. £72,000 would cover a solicitor of my own, a private forensic geneticist if I needed one, and enough runway to make decisions without panic. I spent the next 6 weeks doing nothing visible and everything that mattered. On the first Monday, I visited Dr. Ashworth. She was careful, professional, clearly uncomfortable. She confirmed what I had already pieced together. When my autoimmune panel had come back with markers that were inconsistent with the paternal medical history on file, she had flagged it and recommended further genetic screening. The request had gone to the hospital. Somewhere between the hospital and the family, the results had been rerouted. She did not say intercepted. She did not say suppressed. But her eyes said it. She told me she had raised a concern with the practice manager at the time and been told the patient's father had discussed the matter privately with the consultant and that no further action was required. She had documented her concern in my file. She showed me the note. It was dated 14 months before Grandpa Alec died, which meant Grandpa Alec had likely never known the full shape of it. But he had suspected. He had always suspected. I thanked Dr. Ashworth. She held my hand for a moment at the door and said something I have not forgotten. She said, "I am sorry this was not handled differently, Nora. You deserved a straight answer from the start." I nodded and walked to my car and did not cry. The time for crying in cars was over. On the second week, I drove to Whitstable and sat with Aunt Margaret. She made strong tea in mismatched mugs and did not pretend she did not know why I was there. She told me she had known since before I was born. Mum had confided in her during the pregnancy, terrified, confused, already trapped. There had been someone else, briefly, a colleague at the hospital where Mum had worked as an administrative coordinator. It had lasted 3 months. When Mum found out she was pregnant, she ended it immediately and never told the man. She told Dad, and Dad, according to Aunt Margaret, had gone very quiet for about a week and then come back with a plan. The plan was simple. No one would ever know. The child would carry his name. He would stay, but the debt would be permanent. Aunt Margaret said that last word with a particular weight. Permanent. She said, "Your mother has been paying for one mistake for 31 years, and he has made sure she never forgets the exchange rate." I asked Aunt Margaret why she had never told me. She looked out the window at the gray line of the sea and said, "Because your mother begged me not to, and I loved her more than I loved the truth. I am not proud of that." I did not judge her. I understood the arithmetic of loyalty in families, how it bends people into shapes they never intended to hold. During those weeks, I also met Philip Drayton, the solicitor in Canterbury. He was in his 60s, meticulous, with a desk so organized it looked like a museum exhibit. He had managed Grandpa Alec's trust since its creation and confirmed that the funds were entirely mine, ring-fenced, untouchable by any other family member. I told him I might need a family solicitor experienced in medical records disclosure and potential civil claims. He did not flinch. He gave me 2 names and said he had been expecting my call for some time. I chose the first name, a woman called Sarah Lennox, based in London. I liked her because within 5 minutes of our first phone call, she said, "Tell me what happened," and then did not interrupt for 20 minutes. When I finished, she said 3 words. "You have options." That was all I needed to hear. Not promises, not outrage, options. Dad, meanwhile, carried on. He phoned me on a Sunday to remind me about his birthday dinner in 3 weeks, a reservation at a restaurant in Sevenoaks. He mentioned that James and Olivia would be there, that James was bringing his new girlfriend, that Mum was organizing a cake. His voice had the usual texture, pleasant, controlled, the voice of a man who believed the architecture of his life was still intact. He asked me if I was well. I said yes. He said, "Good, good." There was a pause. He asked if anything was wrong. I said, "No, nothing is wrong." And I meant it. Nothing was wrong. For the first time in 31 years, something was finally, precisely, right. The restaurant was called The Vine, tucked into a narrow lane off Sevenoaks High Street, the kind of place with exposed brick walls and cloth napkins folded into triangles and small candles on every table that made everyone look slightly golden and slightly kinder than they actually were. Dad had chosen it, of course. He always chose the restaurant. He chose the wine before anyone sat down. He chose the seating arrangement. That evening, he had placed himself at the head, Mum to his left, James and his girlfriend Sophie to his right, and me at the far end, next to an empty chair that was eventually removed by a waiter who smiled apologetically, as though the absence of a guest at my side was a mild social embarrassment rather than a summary of how this family had always worked. I arrived early. 20 minutes early. I wanted to sit in my car in the car park behind the restaurant and breathe. The air outside smelled like wet stone and the last warmth of September. I could hear the faint hum of traffic on the A25, and a blackbird somewhere in the hedgerow behind the bins. I opened my handbag and looked at the envelope inside. Not the original from Dr. Pallister. A copy, notarized, along with a second envelope containing the printed correspondence between my father and Dr. Okafor, the correspondence that Ruth Adeyemi had obtained through a formal subject access request on my behalf. Correspondence that included my father's personal email asking Dr. Okafor to reconsider the initial findings, his follow-up email referencing a private donation to the clinic's research fund, and Dr. Okafor's reply confirming that the results had been reviewed and that a revised summary would be sent to the family. The revised summary was the one my parents had shown me when I was 17, the one that confirmed I was biologically my father's daughter. The original, unrevised report said otherwise. I closed the handbag. I did not need to read any of it again. I had read it so many times the sentences had become textures rather than words. I could feel them in my fingertips. Inside, the table was already half full. James stood when I came in, which was new. He hugged me, also new. Sophie shook my hand with the careful warmth of someone who had been briefed. Mum kissed my cheek and told me I looked thin. Dad was pouring wine and did not look up immediately. But when he did, he smiled and said, "There she is," and raised his glass, and the candlelight caught his signet ring, the same ring he had worn for 40 years, the same ring that had once made me feel safe when he held my hand crossing the road outside our house in Bromley. The meal moved the way his meals always moved. He told a story about a colleague. He asked James about work. He complimented Sophie on her dress. He ordered a second bottle without consulting anyone. Mum watched him with the expression she had perfected across 3 decades. Attentive and slightly vacant. Present and absent at the same time. I ate my starter. I ate my main. I laughed at the right moments. I asked Sophie where she grew up. "Guildford," she said. "Lovely," I said. And it was. Everything was lovely. The food, the wine, the warm brick, the candles. Lovely. It was during dessert that he made the toast. He stood, which was unnecessary for a table of 5, but he stood because standing was what he did. He held his glass and said he wanted to thank everyone for being here, that family was what mattered, that he was proud of his children, both of them, and that he hoped this year would bring even more reasons to celebrate. He looked at James when he said both of them. Then he looked at me and added, "And especially you, Naomi, who has always been so strong and so quiet about it." The table waited for me to smile. I smiled. Then I reached into my handbag. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand. I placed the first envelope on the table beside my dessert plate and said, "Dad, I want to give you something before we finish." He looked at the envelope the way you look at a parking ticket, confused and faintly irritated. I said, "This is a copy of my original DNA test results from 2009, the ones Dr. Okafor was asked to revise after you contacted him privately." The table went silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that has weight, that presses on your eardrums, that makes the clink of a glass at another table sound like something breaking. Mum put her fork down. James said, "What?" Sophie looked at her plate. Dad did not move. His hand was still on his wine glass, suspended halfway between the table and his mouth, and his face did something I had never seen before. It did not collapse, and it did not harden. It went blank. Completely, totally blank, as though someone had reached behind his eyes and switched off the projector. I placed the second envelope beside the first. "This," I said, "is the correspondence between you and Dr. Okafor, including your email referencing a donation to the clinic." I obtained these through a subject access request. Ruth Adeyemi helped me. You might remember Ruth. She is the solicitor you once described at Christmas dinner as the type of woman who makes everything into a legal problem. Dad set his glass down. The wine trembled. He looked at Mum, and in that look I saw everything I needed to see. The confirmation that she knew, that she had always known, that the architecture of our family was not built on love or tradition or shared history, but on a single administrative act, the falsification of a medical document to preserve a man's image of himself. He said, "Naomi, this is not the place." His voice was low, controlled, the same voice he used on the phone when he told me about the reservation. The voice of management. The voice of a man who believed that tone was the same as authority. I said, "I agree, this is not the place." "But you chose the place, Dad. You always choose the place." James picked up the first envelope. I watched him read. His jaw moved once, twice, the way it used to move when he was a boy, trying not to cry after falling off his bike. Sophie touched his arm. He did not look at her. He looked at Dad and said, "Is this real?" Dad said nothing. James said, "Is this real?" Louder now, not shouting, but louder, and a couple at the next table glanced over, and the waiter paused near the kitchen door. Mom spoke. She said, "Please, not here. Let us go home and discuss this properly." Her voice broke on the word properly. It was the first honest sound she had made all evening. I picked up my coat. I said, "I am not going home with you. I am going to my flat. If anyone wants to talk, they know my number." I left 40 pounds on the table for my share. I put on my coat. I walked past the candles and the brick and the golden light, and I pushed open the door, and the September air hit my face like cold water, and I stood on the pavement and breathed. My hands were steady. My pulse was even. I felt nothing dramatic, no surge, no flood, no cinematic release. I felt like a woman who had finally said a true thing in a room full of beautiful lies. And that was enough. The next morning, I woke at 5:30 without an alarm. Gray light through the curtains. The flat was quiet, and the radiator ticked the way it always does when the heating comes on early. I lay there for a few minutes and listened to the city starting up outside. A bus on the Holloway Road. Someone dragging a wheelie bin. Normal sounds. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table and waited. The first call came at 7:12. Mum. I let it ring out. She called again at 7:19, again at 7:31. Then a text. "Please, Elena, we need to talk about last night." I read it and put the phone face down on the table and drank my tea. Dad called at 8:15. I answered that one. His voice was different from anything I had heard before. Not the confident baritone that filled courtrooms and dinner parties. Not the careful, measured tone he used when explaining why something was not his fault. This was smaller, rougher. He said, "Elena, I want to explain." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "Not on the phone." I said, "Then write me a letter." He was quiet for 11 seconds, I counted. Then he said, "Please." I said, "Dad, you had 23 years to say please. You had 23 years to tell me the truth. You paid a man to hide a medical result that affected my health and my identity, and you did it because it was more convenient for you. So no, not on the phone and not in person. Write it down, put it on paper, sign it. Then I will decide if I want to read it." He hung up. Richard called at 9. My brother, half-brother. I still did not know what word to use, and I was not sure it mattered. He said, "Lena, what happened last night?" He had not been at the dinner. He lived in Bristol with his girlfriend and their son, and he only came to London for Christmas and birthdays. I told him. All of it. The DNA test, Dr. Hargreaves, the forged report, the payments. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "That explains a lot, actually." I asked what he meant. He said, "Do you remember when we were kids and you asked Mom why you had brown eyes and everyone else had blue, and she changed the subject so fast she knocked over a glass of wine?" I did remember. I was 9. The wine was red, and it stained the tablecloth, and Mum scrubbed it for 20 minutes and never answered the question. Richard said he loved me, and that I was his sister regardless of whatever nonsense the adults had done. I believed him. He was the one good thing that family had produced without conditions attached. The formal consequences came over the next 6 weeks. I had filed my complaint with the General Medical Council on the Tuesday after the dinner. Dr. Hargreaves was contacted within 10 days. His solicitor responded with a carefully worded letter that admitted nothing and implied everything. But Dr. Amara Osei had kept her copies. She had the original, unredacted report. She had the email trail between Hargreaves and the private lab. She had the bank transfer records that my father had apparently routed through his firm's client account, which was itself a violation of Solicitors Regulation Authority rules. She had everything, because she was methodical and patient, and she believed that the truth was a medical instrument, not a negotiable commodity. The GMC launched a formal fitness to practice investigation. Dr. Hargreaves was suspended from clinical duties pending the outcome. His practice in Harley Street put out a brief statement about a period of leave for personal reasons. I read it online and felt nothing. My father's situation was worse. The SRA opened their own investigation into the misuse of client funds. His partners at Whitfield Cross and Lane called an emergency meeting. I heard about this from Richard, who heard it from a colleague who worked in commercial litigation in the same building. Dad was asked to take a leave of absence. The word they used was voluntary, but there was nothing voluntary about it. He was 61 years old, and he had spent 34 years building that firm, and now he was being walked out of it because he had paid £4,800 to hide the fact that his daughter was not biologically his. Mum called me every day for 3 weeks. I answered twice. The first time she cried and said she was sorry and that she had wanted to tell me so many times. I asked her who my biological father was. She said his name was Tomasz Kowalski. He was a Polish engineer she had met at a conference in Manchester in 1999. It lasted 4 months. She ended it before she knew she was pregnant, and when she found out, she convinced herself, and then convinced Dad, that the timing worked. When the DNA test came back wrong, she panicked, and Dad took over and managed it the way he managed everything, with money and silence, and the assumption that control was the same thing as care. The second time I answered, she asked if I was going to contact Tomasz. I said I did not know. She said he moved back to Krakow in 2003. She had not spoken to him since. I thanked her for the information and said goodbye, and sat in my kitchen and looked at the name I had written on the back of an envelope. Tomasz Kowalski. A stranger who shared my chromosomes. I put the envelope in a drawer and closed it. My grandfather had died 4 years ago, but I kept a photograph of him on the shelf above my desk. Albert Whitfield. Not my biological grandfather either, as it turned out, but he was the one who taught me to fish on the River Lee when I was 7. He was the one who said, "Elena, love, the quiet is not empty. It is where you keep the things that matter." He was the one who looked at me once when I was 14 and said, "You are tougher than all of them, and they know it, and that is why they talk so loud around you." I wondered if he knew. I think he might have. He never treated me differently from Richard, but sometimes he looked at me with something that was not quite sadness and not quite pride, but something in between. as if he understood the shape of me better than anyone, and chose to love that shape without needing to name it. 3 people reached out to me in the weeks after. A cousin named Sarah, who sent a card with no words inside, just her phone number. A woman from my father's firm named Patricia, who had been his secretary for 15 years and who wrote me an email saying she always thought something was wrong and she was sorry she never said anything. And Dr. Osei, who called me on a Wednesday evening and asked simply how I was doing. Not as a doctor, as a person. I told her I was all right. She said good. Then she said, "Elena, you should know that what your father did was not about you. It was about him. People who hide the truth are not protecting the person they are hiding it from. They are protecting themselves from having to become someone different." I wrote that down after she hung up. I still have it on a piece of paper pinned to my corkboard. There was a phrase my grandfather used to say to me when I was small. He would sit in his armchair in that house in Sefton Park with a cup of tea going cold on the side table, and he would watch me struggle with something. A maths problem, a stuck zipper, a word I could not spell. He never rushed to help. He would wait until I either solved it or gave up, and then he would say the same thing every time. He would say, "Elena, the tree does not grow by pulling itself up. It grows by pushing its roots down deeper into what is already there." I never understood that when I was 8. I thought it was one of those things old people say because they have run out of real advice. I nodded and went back to whatever I was doing, and he smiled and drank his cold tea, and that was that. But after everything that happened with my father, and the DNA results, and the court, and the fallout, I found myself thinking about that phrase almost every day. Not because it suddenly made perfect sense, but because I was starting to understand what it cost him to say it. My grandfather knew. I am almost certain of that now. He knew that my father was not my biological father, or, at the very least, he suspected it strongly enough that the knowledge sat in him like a stone for years. He never told me. He never told anyone, as far as I can determine. But the way he treated me was different from how he treated my sister. Not worse, not better, just different. There was a carefulness to it, a deliberateness, as though every act of love he showed me was also an act of defiance against something I could not see. He died believing I would figure it out eventually. Or maybe he died hoping I would not have to. Either way, he left me that phrase, and I carried it around like a pebble in my coat pocket for 20 years without knowing what it weighed. Now I know. The roots he was talking about were not accomplishments. They were not the degree or the commission or the strength I built in my body to compensate for what I lacked in certainty. The roots were the willingness to stay in the soil, even when the soil was full of things that made no sense. To keep growing, not upward and not outward, but downward, into yourself, into the parts you would rather not look at. I spent a long time being proud of how well I handled everything. The steadiness, the composure, the way I stood in that courtroom and did not flinch. And I am not saying that was false. It was real. But it was also a kind of armor, and I wore it so long that I forgot it was not my skin. The truth is, I should have spoken sooner. Not in the courtroom. Earlier. Years earlier. When my father first started treating me as less than. When my mother first looked away instead of stepping forward. When the pattern became clear and I chose silence because silence felt like strength, and because I was afraid that speaking would make me small in the way they already believed I was. I told myself I was being strategic, patient, that I was waiting for the right moment. And some of that is true, but some of it was just fear dressed up in discipline. I know that now. I can hold both things at the same time. I can be proud of what I did and honest about what I avoided, and neither one cancels the other out. My mother called me 5 months after the settlement. It was late, past 11. I was sitting in the kitchen of my new flat in Woolton, with the window cracked open because the radiator was stuck on high, and the air smelled like paint from the hallway where the landlord had been redecorating. She said, "Elena, I want you to know that I loved your father. Not as an excuse, just as a fact." I said, "I know." She said, "I also want you to know that what I did was wrong, and I do not expect you to forgive me, and I am not asking you to." I said, "I know that too." There was a pause. Then she said, "Your grandfather would have been proud of you." And that is when my voice broke. Not before. Not in the courtroom. Not in the solicitor's office. Not in the car outside the hospital. There, in my kitchen, at 11 at night, with paint fumes coming through the crack in the window and my mother's voice thin and cracked on the other end of the line. I did not sob. I just stopped being able to speak for about 10 seconds, and she waited, and neither of us hung up, and that was the most honest moment we had shared in perhaps my entire life. I do not think forgiveness is a single event. I think it is something you do in small amounts over a long time, like paying off a debt you did not choose to take on. I am not there yet with my mother. I am not there yet with my father. I may never be there with my father. But I am no longer carrying the weight of pretending that it does not matter. It matters. It mattered then, and it matters now, and the fact that I survived it does not make it acceptable. It just makes it survivable. My grandfather's phrase comes back to me at odd moments. When I am driving and the road is empty. When I am standing in the queue at Tesco and someone ahead of me is arguing about a coupon. When I wake at 4 in the morning and the room is dark and the city is quiet and I can hear my own breathing and nothing else. The tree does not grow by pulling itself up. I used to think he was telling me to be patient. Now I think he was telling me something harder. He was telling me to stop performing strength and start living in it. To stop reaching for proof that I mattered, and instead to sit with the knowledge that I already did, that the roots were already there, that they had always been there. That no one, not my father, not my mother, not a falsified blood test, not a bribed lab technician could pull them out because they were mine, and they went deeper than anyone knew. I pinned Dr. Osei's words next to my grandfather's phrase on the corkboard above my desk. 2 pieces of paper, 2 truths. One from a man who loved me and could not say why. One from a woman who barely knew me and said exactly what I needed to hear. Between them there is a small gap. I left it there on purpose. I have not decided what belongs in that space yet. Maybe nothing. Maybe that is the point. Some nights I still drive out to Headington after work. Not to the hospital, not to my grandfather's old house either, because the new owners painted the door a shade of green that would have made him wince. I drive to the bench at the top of Shotover Hill, where he used to sit with his thermos and his silence, and I park and I walk up the path in whatever shoes I happen to be wearing, and I sit there, and I look at Oxford spread out below me in the dark, with its spires and its amber streetlights, and its absolute indifference to everything I have been through. It is a good indifference. The city does not care. The river does not care. The cold does not care. And somehow that is the most comforting thing in the world, because it means the pain is mine, and I get to decide what shape it takes. My name is Abigail Hale. I am 34 years old. I am a trauma registrar at the John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford, and I am the biological daughter of a man who spent 14 years and tens of thousands of pounds making sure no one, including me, would ever know that. He failed. Not because the system caught him, not because justice is inevitable, not because good always wins. He failed because one doctor in one lab on one Tuesday afternoon looked at a screen and chose not to look away. That is all it took. One person who refused to be convenient. I think about that a lot. I think about how many times I have been in a position to look away from something uncomfortable on a chart, or in a scan, or in a patient's eyes, and I think about the weight of that choice. It is not dramatic. It never is. It is a Tuesday. It is fluorescent lighting and cold coffee and a result that does not match, and the quiet internal question of whether it is easier to flag it or to let it go. Dr. Osei flagged it. She did not know me. She owed me nothing. She simply believed that a person has the right to know what is true about their own blood. I try to be that person now. In the trauma bay, when a family is falling apart in the relative's room, and the easiest thing would be to soften the edges, I do not soften them. I am kind. I am always kind. But I do not lie. I do not rearrange the truth to make it more comfortable, because I know what it feels like to live inside a rearranged truth for years and to feel the wrongness of it in your bones without being able to name it. My mother calls once a month now. The conversations last about 7 minutes. She asks about the weather. I tell her. She asks about work. I say it is busy. She does not ask about my father. I do not mention him. We are two people standing on opposite sides of a river that neither of us built, but neither of us knows how to cross either. I do not hate her. I think I understand her, which is harder. She was afraid. She has been afraid her entire life. And fear made her a collaborator in something she should have fought. And now she has to live with that, and I think she does live with it every single day in the silence between her words. My half-brother James sent me a message 2 weeks ago. Just 3 words. Thinking of you. I have not replied yet. I will. I am just not sure what to say that is honest without being heavy. He is 20, and he did not choose any of this. None of us chose any of this. My grandfather's phrase is still pinned to my corkboard. Quiet things hold. I read it every morning when I sit down at my desk, and every morning it means something slightly different. Some days it means patience. Some days it means stubbornness. Some days it means that the things you do not say out loud are the things that keep you standing when everything else is noise. Today it means something new. Today, I think it means that love does not have to be loud to be real. That the man who sat with me on a bench on Shotover Hill and said nothing and poured me terrible tea from a dented thermos loved me more clearly than anyone who ever made a speech about family or duty or blood. He loved me in thermoses and in silence and in the quiet act of showing up. And he loved me knowing what he knew, which was everything, and he never once let the knowing make him look at me differently. That is the kind of doctor I want to be. That is the kind of person I want to be. Not loud, not righteous, just present, just refusing to look away. If you are listening to this and you feel like something in your life does not fit and you cannot explain it, and people keep telling you that you are imagining things, I want you to know that you are not imagining things. You are not difficult. You are not too sensitive. You are a person whose body knows what your mind has not been allowed to see yet. Trust it. Be patient with yourself, but do not stop asking the question. The answer is yours. It was always yours. The hill is dark now. The thermos I brought is empty. The city below me hums the way cities do when most people are asleep, and a few people are just beginning to understand something they will spend the rest of their lives learning how to carry. I stand up. I brush the grass from my coat. I walk back down the path to my car. Quiet things hold. They do. I know, because I am one of them.